The land deed hit the porch railing at midnight with a sound like a gunshot, and Mamie Shepard nearly fired the rifle she had raised to her shoulder before she recognized the man standing in her front yard. Edgar Finley. He stood 20 feet from her door with his hands raised, his dark hat tilted low against the wind that came howling across the Kansas plains, and the moonlight caught the silver concho buttons along his vest the same way it caught the barrel of her Winchester. He was broader in the shoulders than she remembered, and his jaw carried a shadow of a beard that had not been there when she was 17, but the eyes were the same. Dark brown, steady, and full of something she had never quite been able to name. "Don't shoot me, Mamie," he said. His voice was quiet and rough, the kind of voice that came from years of not talking unless it mattered. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't. Because that paper behind me on your railing is worth more to you than my death is." Her eyes flicked sideways without fully leaving him. The folded document sat there, half caught on a splinter of painted wood, fluttering at its corner in the night wind. She could see the county seal even from where she stood, the embossed circle pressed into yellowed paper. She had not seen that seal in 3 years, not since the day Harlan Pruitt and his men had walked into her father's house and laid it all out like a card game her father had already lost. Not since the day her father's heart had finally broken clean through and he had lain down in the bed and never gotten up again. She did not lower the rifle. "Where did you get that?" "That's a long story. I have time." "I don't." His eyes moved to the dark ridge line north of her property, a slow and practiced glance that told her everything. "Pruitt's men are 2 hours behind me, maybe less. I had to ride hard to get here before them. You need to take that deed and get yourself a lawyer in Dodge City by morning." "And what about you?" Something shifted in his expression then, something she was not supposed to see, and he pulled it back behind that careful steadiness before it fully formed. "I'll manage." The wind pushed the deed further toward the edge of the railing. Mamie lowered the rifle, crossed the porch in 3 strides, and caught the paper before it could fall into the mud. The moment her fingers closed around it, she felt the weight of everything it represented, her father's 40 years of labor, every fence post he had driven into that stubborn ground, every winter he had worked with cracked hands and frozen boots to hold on to this piece of earth. And now it was here, returned, by the last man she would have expected. She looked up at Edgar Finley from the porch. He had already taken hold of his horse's reins. "Wait," she said. He paused. "Come inside before you ride away." He did not move for a long moment. The wind moved between them like a third presence. And then slowly, he looped his horse's reins around the porch post and walked up the 3 steps to her door. 3 years earlier, the town of Hadley Ford, Kansas, had been the kind of place a person could still believe in. In the spring of 1881, when the buffalo grass came up green across the flats, and the creek ran clear and fast, it looked exactly like what it was, a frontier settlement in the middle of building itself into something permanent. There was a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a church that was used for school 3 days a week, and a town meeting the other 2, a blacksmith who had expanded into a small machine repair operation, and 3 saloons that stood in a row on the east end of Main Street as though they were each other's moral support. Thomas Shepard had settled his claim north of town in 1867, 2 years after Appomattox, when he had come west with nothing but a union discharge paper and a willingness to work until his hands bled. He had worked until they bled quite a lot, actually, and by 1881, the Shepard place was 320 acres of the finest mixed-grass prairie in Comanche County, with a good well, a sound house, and a barn that had not fallen down in the last 3 blizzards. He had a small cattle operation, a kitchen garden that his daughter Mamie kept, and an arrangement with 2 neighboring families to share a hay baler that saved all 3 of them from having to spend money they did not have on separate equipment. Thomas Shepard was respected in Hadley Ford. He was also, quietly, ruined. It had started with the drought of 1879, which had been followed by the cattle tick fever of 1880, which had been followed by a banknote coming due at the First Commercial Bank of Dodge City, at a time when Thomas Shepard had less than $40 in his account, and a herd that was worth nothing until it was worth everything, which was a calculation that depended entirely on whether it survived the winter. He had borrowed against the land to keep the cattle, and the cattle had died anyway, and by the spring of 1881, the note on his land was held by a man named Harlan Prout, who had purchased it from the bank for 60 cents on the dollar during a period when Thomas Shepard had not been watching closely enough. Harlan Prout was not from Hadley Ford. He had arrived in 1879 from somewhere in Missouri and had brought money with him, which in Comanche County at that moment in history was all the introduction a man needed. He had started buying distressed land notes from the Dodge City Bank. He had started financing homesteaders at terms that looked fair until you read the fine print, and he had a lawyer in Wichita and a sheriff in his pocket, and a way of smiling at you that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up while your brain was still trying to figure out what he had just said. Mamie Shepard had been 19 years old in the spring of 1881, and she had understood all of this with a clarity that had cost her considerable sleep. She had read every document. She had sat at the kitchen table with her father on winter evenings and gone through the numbers by lamplight, looking for the error, the way out, the thing they had missed. There was no thing they had missed. The numbers were exactly as bad as they appeared. What she had not understood, or not fully understood, was that Harlan Prout's ambitions did not stop at the Shepard place. He wanted the whole north quarter of Comanche County, 7 or 8 ranches worth, and he intended to turn it into a cattle empire that would feed the Kansas City stockyards and make him genuinely wealthy rather than merely powerful on a local scale. He had a financial arrangement with a railroad land agent that required him to present clear title to approximately 40,000 acres within 24 months, and the Shepard place sat directly in the middle of the corridor he needed. Edgar Finley had come to town in the fall of 1880. He had arrived on a gray horse with a saddle that had seen better decades, wearing clothes that were clean but worn, and he had taken a room at the Cattlemen's Hotel and introduced himself as a man looking for day work. He was 25 years old, which Mamie had noted somewhat against her own better judgment. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and a quality of attention when he looked at something that suggested he was seeing rather more of it than most people bothered to. He got work at the Shepard place because Thomas Shepard was short-handed after the tick fever had driven off 2 of his 3 hands, and because Edgar Finley turned out to be genuinely skilled with fence work and water management, and the particular kind of patient, methodical problem-solving that cattle operations required. He also turned out to be something else, which Mamie did not discover until much later. She discovered it through the way he spoke to her father, which was with respect but not deference, as though he recognized in Thomas Shepard a man worth learning from rather than simply a man worth keeping employed by. She discovered it through the way he handled the horses, which was firm and gentle and entirely free of the cruelty that a lot of men used as a shortcut to submission. She discovered it through small things, the way he fixed the gate latch she had been meaning to ask someone to fix for 3 months, without being asked, without mentioning it, leaving it simply fixed when she came out one morning. The way he sat on the fence after supper and watched the sunset with an expression that suggested he found it genuinely worth watching. She discovered it through the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. And then she discovered the other thing, the dark past he had brought with him in that worn saddle, and for a while it changed everything. It had been her friend Delia Marsh who had told her, in the breathless way Delia had of delivering information that was going to cause pain, as though the delivery speed might reduce the impact. Edgar Finley was not merely a drifting day laborer looking for honest work. He had a name in certain circles, the circles that ran south of the law, and the name he had in those circles was a man who had ridden for a while with the Calhoun outfit out of Indian Territory. Not a significant member, not a man with wanted posters, but connected and known, and not entirely the simple, honest workman he had presented himself as. Mamie had sat with this information for 4 days before she said anything to him directly, which was, she later reflected, 4 days longer than most women would have given it. She found him at the stock tank one evening, repairing a section of the overflow pipe, and she told him plainly that she had heard something about his history and she would like to hear his version of it before she drew any conclusions. He had set down the wrench he was holding and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You heard right," he said, "and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Then, why did you come here? Because I'm trying to be a different kind of man than I was." "That's not a very detailed answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She had waited, and he had looked out at the water in the stock tank, and then he had told her enough that she could form a picture. He had been 19 and broke and angry at things that were genuinely worth being angry about: a father who had drunk himself off a homestead claim in Nebraska, a mother who had died of something the doctor called fever, but which had more to do with poverty and overwork than any specific pathogen, a younger sister he had been unable to support, and a world that had seemed, from where he was standing, entirely constructed to benefit the people who already had everything and to grind down the people who had nothing. When a man named Calhoun had offered him a way to get back at that world, he had been young enough and angry enough and desperate enough to take it. He had ridden with Calhoun for 14 months. In that time he had done things he was not proud of, though he had drawn lines he had not crossed. He had never killed anyone. He had left before the outfit went into the kind of operations that would have required him to. He had taken his horse and his few possessions and ridden north, and tried to put enough distance between himself and that period of his life to begin again. Mamie had listened to all of this while the evening light fell across the water of the stock tank, and the cattle came and went, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch went on around them. "Are you still in danger from that?" she had asked. "From those men or from the law? There's no paper on me," he said, "and Calhoun's dead. His outfit dissolved when he died, most of the men scattered." "That doesn't fully answer the question." He had looked at her then directly with those steady dark eyes. "There are people who know my name from that time. I don't know all of who they are. I try to stay low and keep my nose clean and hope it stays quiet." She had thought about that. Then she had said, "My father needs to know." "I know." "I'll tell him, or you can, but he needs to know." "I'll tell him." He had told Thomas Shepard the following morning, at the kitchen table, with Mamie present and the coffee getting cold between them. Thomas had listened all the way through without interrupting, which was a quality Mamie had always admired in her father, the ability to let a man finish what he had to say before deciding what to think about it. Then Thomas had said, "You've been nothing but straight-dealing and hardworking since you got here, and I'd rather judge a man on what he does in front of me than on what he did before I knew him. You can stay. But if any piece of that old business comes anywhere near this land, I need to know immediately." "Yes, sir," Edgar had said. That had been November of 1880. By February of 1881, Mamie Shepard was in love with Edgar Finley, in the way that people fall in love in hard winters in isolated places, which is to say deeply and completely, and with a kind of terrifying clarity about what is happening and no particular way to stop it. They had talked for hours in the way that two people talk when they are both intelligent and both lonely and both surprised to have found someone they can speak to without having to simplify themselves. They had walked fence lines in the brittle cold. He had helped her with the kitchen garden planning for spring. She had read to him in the evenings, because it turned out his education had been interrupted early and he read slowly and with difficulty, and he had listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything. She had not kissed him. He had not kissed her. But there was a conversation happening between them that did not require words, and both of them were aware of it, and it made the air between them feel charged and specific in the way that weather feels before it changes. And then Harlan Pruitt had come. He had come on a Tuesday in March, in a buggy, with his lawyer beside him and two large men riding behind, and he had sat in Thomas Shepard's parlor and laid out the situation in language that was technically polite and functionally a declaration of war. The note was due. The amount owed was beyond Thomas Shepard's present means. Pruitt was prepared to foreclose immediately, and here was the offer, presented as generosity. He would accept a deed transfer now, allow Thomas and his daughter to stay on the property as tenants for one additional growing season, and pay Thomas a consideration of $200, which was described as fairness, but which represented less than 0.5% of the land's actual value. Thomas Shepard had told Pruitt exactly what he thought of his consideration in terms that were not technically polite at all. Pruitt had smiled and left. He had come back 3 days later without the buggy this time, with a sheriff's deputy and a different lawyer and the actual foreclosure documents. It was faster than it should have been, faster than the law technically allowed, but the law in Comanche County was a flexible instrument in 1881, and Pruitt had been flexing it for 2 years. By the time a fair-minded judge might have reviewed the proceedings, the deed would be transferred, and the Shepard place would be Pruitt property, and the Shepards would have whatever 45 days the courts allowed before they were out. It was on the second visit, while the deputy was explaining the process to Thomas Shepard in the kitchen, that Mamie had looked for Edgar and found him gone. His horse was gone. His saddle was gone. The small box he kept under his bunk in the hands' quarters was gone. He had left nothing behind except a folded piece of paper on his cot that said, simply, "I am sorry. I will try to fix this. Do not wait for me." She had stood in the doorway of the hands' quarters and read that note 3 times. And then she had gone back into the house and stood beside her father while the deputy finished his explanation, and she had said nothing about the note. And she had told herself very firmly that whatever she had believed was growing between her and Edgar Finley had been a story she was telling herself, a comfortable fiction constructed from evening conversations and a pair of steady dark eyes, and that she needed to put it away and deal with what was real. What was real was that her father had lost his land. What was real was that Thomas Shepard was 61 years old and had been holding himself together on will and habit for 2 years of drought and disease and financial disaster, and the loss of the land that represented his entire life's work broke something in him that could not be repaired. He did not die dramatically. He simply declined, in the way of men who have held on through sheer determination, until the thing they were holding on for is taken from them. By June, he was spending most of each day in bed. By August, he was gone, quietly in his sleep, leaving Mamie alone in a house that was no longer hers on land that had been signed away under terms she still believed were fraudulent, but could not prove without a lawyer she could not afford and documents she did not have. She had stayed. Pruitt had not immediately pressed her to leave, perhaps because evicting a newly bereaved woman from her dead father's house would have generated the wrong kind of talk in a town where he still needed some degree of community tolerance. She had worked the kitchen garden. She had taken in laundry. She had written letters to the county recorder's office in Dodge City and received polite non-answers. She had written to a lawyer in Wichita and received a letter that explained what she already knew, which was that without the original land deed she could not challenge the foreclosure. The original land deed had disappeared along with Harlan Pruitt. She had thought about Edgar Finley approximately once an hour for 3 years, in the way that you think about a wound, not with longing but with a kind of recurring inventory, checking whether it had healed yet and finding that it had not. And then he had appeared in her front yard at midnight with the deed in his hand. He sat at her kitchen table now, in the same chair he had always sat in, and she set coffee in front of him and set the land deed on the table between them where they could both see it, and she sat down across from him and waited. He looked at the deed for a moment, then at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him set down his coffee cup carefully before he started talking. "When Pruitt came the second time," he said, I recognized one of the men with him. Not the deputy, not the lawyer. The man behind the deputy on the right side. His name is Cole Yarrow. He was with the Calhoun outfit when I was. He left about 6 months before I did. Mamie felt something shift in her chest. He works for Prout. He's been working for Prout for about 2 years, best I can tell. When I saw him, I understood something that hadn't been clear to me before. Edgar paused, turned the coffee cup in his hands. Prout isn't just a land speculator. He's been using men from that old outfit, not to do anything dramatic, not robbery, nothing that draws a marshal, just muscle. Witnesses who will say whatever they're paid to say. A recorder's clerk who lost the right documents at the right time. The kind of fraud that's very hard to see if you're only looking at it from the outside. He stole the deed, Mamie said. Not a question. He had Yarrow take it from the county recorder's office in Dodge City. The original filing. Not a copy, the original, with your father's signature and the land grant date from 1867. Without it, any challenge to the foreclosure looked like a dispute between your father's word and Prout's documentation, and Prout had better documentation because he'd manufactured it. Mamie's hands were flat on the table. Where has it been for 3 years? In a strongbox in Prout's office in Dodge City. Under 3 other land deeds he stole the same way. Edgar looked at her steadily. I know because I went and got it. The silence in the kitchen was absolute except for the wind outside and the soft sound of the lamp flame. You robbed Harlan Prout. I broke into his office and took property that wasn't his. Whether that's robbery is a legal question I'll leave to someone else. Edgar. Her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. Is that why you left? You recognized Yarrow and you left too to go do this? Not immediately. I left because Yarrow recognized me too, and I was afraid that if I stayed, Prout would use what he knew about my past to discredit your father's position even further. A hired hand with a history in an outlaw outfit, testifying on behalf of the foreclosed party. It would have made things worse. You should have told me that. I know. That note was. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. That note was not sufficient, Edgar. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, and she could see that he knew exactly how insufficient it had been, and that he was not going to argue about it or make excuses for it. He was simply sitting with it, the way he sat with things, with that patient steadiness that had always both impressed her and made her want to shake him. Where have you been for 3 years? Moving. Staying low. Yarrow knew my face and he would have told Prout, so I couldn't stay anywhere close to here. I tried 3 times to get to Prout's records, and I couldn't get close enough without being caught. I finally got an in about 4 months ago through a man who works at a saloon in Dodge City and owes me a very old favor, and I spent 3 months planning it carefully enough that I could get in and out without raising an alarm immediately. He paused. I got the deed and 3 others. The other 3 I left at the county recorder's office in Dodge City with a letter explaining what they were. Mamie stared at him. You left them at the recorder's office. At midnight, yes. Same way I came here. I figured if I walked in during business hours, someone might shoot me before I could explain. She put her hands over her face for a moment. She was not crying. She was doing something else, something more complicated than crying, processing a series of revelations in the only way she knew how, which was all at once and in very fast succession. Her father's land. 3 years of Edgar Finley being somewhere out there doing this specific thing. The note on the cot. The way she had made herself believe it meant nothing. She lowered her hands. Prout's men are behind you, she said. 2 hours, maybe less. They'll have found the strongbox empty by now. Yarrow will know it was me. Then you have to get out of here. That's what I was planning to do before you told me to come inside. Looked at him. You are the most frustrating man I have ever met. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. You've met very few men, Mamie. You live on a farm. I live on a farm that I'm going to get back, she said, picking up the deed, because of you, and you were going to just leave it on the porch railing and ride away. You had a rifle pointed at me. That's not a good excuse. You were going to shoot me. I was not going to shoot you. She set the deed down and met his eyes. I recognized you. The almost smile changed into something else, something she had not seen on his face before, at least not this fully formed, this unguarded. It was a look that was made up in roughly equal parts of hope and the particular terror that hope produces in a person who has spent a long time without it. "Mamie," he said, "there are things we need to talk about," she said. "But first we need to deal with the fact that Pruitt's men are 2 hours away, and you need a plan, and I need to get to Dodge City, and neither of us is going to be able to do anything useful if we don't think this through." He nodded slowly, and the practical man he was reasserted itself over the other thing, and he picked up his coffee cup and began to think out loud while she listened. The plan they arrived at over the next 40 minutes was this. Mamie would ride to the home of Walter Crisp, a neighboring rancher whose land was also under threat from Pruitt, and who had been making his own quiet inquiries for the past year, wake him and his wife, and tell them what had been recovered and what was coming. Walter had a good horse and a dependable son-in-law, and the means to get Mamie and the deed to Dodge City quickly and safely. Edgar would not ride with them. He was the one Pruitt's men were actively hunting, and his presence would slow them and attract exactly the wrong kind of attention. He would ride south and west, toward the Indian Territory border, where he knew the terrain and could stay ahead of pursuit. Mamie did not like this plan. She liked the part about getting to Dodge City. She did not like the part where Edgar rode toward the Indian Territory alone with Pruitt's men behind him. "You'll be in Dodge City by morning," he said. "Get to Judge Harlan Everett, he's the circuit court judge and he's not in Pruitt's pocket. Present the deed. Explain the fraudulent foreclosure. He'll issue an injunction stopping any further land transactions pending review, and that will cut Pruitt's financing arrangement off at the knees. That's what Pruitt's actually afraid of. That's why he's sending men tonight, not to hurt you, but to get the deed back before you reach a judge. And you." "I'll be fine. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She stood up. She took the deed and folded it carefully and put it inside her bodice, under her blouse, against her skin, where no one was going to take it from her without a very significant struggle. She saw Edgar observe this action and look quickly away, and she found that she was not as immune to that small, quickly controlled response as she wanted to be. "If you are not in Dodge City within 1 week," she said, "I am going to find you." "I'll be there," he said. They went outside. He untied his horse from the porch railing and she went to the small barn and saddled her mare, and they stood for a moment in the yard with the night wind between them and the moon overhead and the two horses making soft sounds in the dark. "Edgar," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over, when I have the land back and Pruitt is dealt with, will you come back here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you want me to." "I am asking you to." He nodded once, deliberately, the way he did things. "Then I will." She rode north toward the Crisp place. She did not look back because she had already made that mistake once and she was not going to make it again. Walter Crisp was a broad, patient man of 53 who had built his ranch from a single-room dugout in 1869 and who regarded most crises with the equanimity of a man who had survived a great many of them. He came to his door in his long underwear with a lantern in one hand and a Colt in the other, listened to Mamie's entire explanation without interrupting, and then told his wife to put on coffee while he got dressed. His son-in-law, a young man named Pete Donovan, who had married Walter's eldest daughter 2 years ago, and who was, Mamie reflected, about as steady and reliable a person as you could ask for in an emergency at 1 in the morning, was roused from the small house he and his wife occupied on the east end of Walter's property and brought into the planning within 20 minutes. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Mamie and Pete Donovan were riding east toward Dodge City with a 4-hour head start on anyone Pruitt might have sent, and Walter Crisp was sitting on his porch with a shotgun and a second lantern, not because he expected trouble tonight specifically, but because he had been waiting for a reason to sit on his porch with a shotgun and a second lantern for the past 2 years, and this seemed like exactly the right occasion. The ride to Dodge City in the dark was long and cold, and Mamie spent most of it going over the conversation in her kitchen, in the way that you go over a conversation you know is not finished. Edgar Finley had spent 3 years working toward this. 3 years of moving and staying hidden and planning and attempting and failing and trying again, all for a land deed that would benefit her and her father, except that her father was dead now and would not see the benefit, which was a thought she was not going to allow herself to dwell on because she needed to be clear-headed and functional and not weeping in the dark on horseback. She was 22 years old. She had spent the last 3 years managing her grief and her anger and her practical survival on an extraordinary diet of stubbornness and hard work, and the specific kind of determination that comes from knowing there is no alternative. She had not been waiting for Edgar Finley, not exactly. She had put that away, or tried to. She had told herself she was simply living her life and making the best of what was. She had also, very quietly and only to herself, not entirely given up. Pete Donovan was good company. He was 26, observant, and had enough social sense not to make conversation when conversation was not wanted, and enough genuine decency to make it comfortable when it was. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, and then, when the sky began to turn from black to the very dark blue that precedes dawn, he said, "This man that brought the deed, he works for your father." "He worked for my father," Mamie said, "before my father died." "You know him well?" She considered the question. "Yes," she said, "I know him well." Pete Donovan nodded and did not ask anything further, which elevated him significantly in her estimation. They reached Dodge City as the sun cleared the horizon, arriving dusty and cold but intact. Pete knew the town and knew where the judge's residence was, a solid frame house on the north end of 2nd Avenue, and by 7:30 in the morning Mamie Shepard was sitting across a breakfast table from Judge Harlan Everett, a compact, gray-haired man of 60 who had been a circuit court judge for 11 years and who was, as Edgar had said, entirely outside Pruitt's financial network and correspondingly immune to his influence. The judge listened. He read the deed. He asked 3 precise questions and received 3 clear answers. He called for his clerk and dictated an injunction stopping all property transactions involving Harlan Pruitt's landholdings in Comanche County, pending a full evidentiary review. He was in his courtroom and had the injunction signed and filed by 9 o'clock. He also sent a telegram to the Kansas State Attorney's office in Topeka, which was not something Mamie had thought to ask for, but which Judge Everett apparently considered obligatory, given that the evidence in front of him suggested a pattern of systematic land fraud affecting multiple properties across 2 counties. By noon, Mamie Shepard was sitting in the office of a Dodge City lawyer named Andrew Fessler, who came highly recommended by Judge Everett, and who, after reviewing the deed and the judge's injunction and Mamie's account of events, agreed to represent her in the title challenge at a rate that was, he acknowledged, somewhat reduced from his usual fee in light of what he described as the particular quality of the injustice involved. She was in a hotel room by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sitting on the bed with the land deed in her hands, and she cried then, for approximately 20 minutes, for her father, and for the 3 years, and for everything the document represented, and for the fact that the man who had made this possible was riding somewhere south and west with people behind him who wanted to stop him from reaching anywhere safely. Then she washed her face and went down to the hotel dining room and ate the first full meal she had sat down to in what felt like a very long time. The week that followed was one of the strangest periods of Mamie's life. She stayed in Dodge City as the legal proceedings began to move, because Fessler needed her available for questions and filings, and because Judge Everett wanted her testimony formalized before the review board that was being assembled. The hotel was not expensive and she had some saved money, and Pete Donovan had stayed in town as well, with Walter Crisp's blessing, in case she needed an escort or someone to ride back with. Harlan Pruitt arrived in Dodge City on the 3rd day with his Wichita lawyer, and proceeded to do what men in his position did when cornered by the law, which was to generate enormous amounts of paper and make numerous procedural objections, an attempt to have the review delayed and postponed and referred to other jurisdictions, and generally moved as far into the future as possible. Judge Everett, who had seen this before, denied each objection with the patient thoroughness of a man who did this for a living and was good at it. Cole Yarrow was not with Prout. That was noted and found interesting by more than one person. On the fourth day, a telegram arrived from the Kansas State Attorney's office indicating that investigators had been dispatched. On the fifth day, the county recorder's office in Dodge City confirmed that the 3 other deeds Edgar had left there were from properties also in Comanche County, and also subject to suspicious foreclosure proceedings that were now being reviewed. On the sixth day, Mamie was walking back to the hotel from Fessler's office when she saw a gray horse tied outside the cattleman's hotel. She stopped walking. She looked at the horse for a long moment, at the saddle that had seen better decades, at the specific way the horse was standing in the afternoon light. She walked straight to the hotel entrance and through the lobby and up to the desk and asked the clerk, with a steadiness she was somewhat proud of, whether a man named Edgar Finley had checked in. "Checked in this morning, miss," the clerk said. "Room 7. She went up the stairs and down the hall and knocked on the door of room 7. There was a pause, the kind of pause of a man who has learned to be careful about who is on the other side of a door. Then footsteps and the door opened. He looked tired. Not devastated, he was too controlled for devastation to show directly, but tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who has been running for a long time and has only just allowed himself to stop. There was a bruise along his jaw that had not been there a week ago, yellowish and fading but visible, and a cut above his left ear that had healed into a thin, dark line. "You're here," she said. "I said I would be. What happened to your face?" "Yarrow caught up with me 2 days south of the territory line. There were 3 of them. I got away, but not before one of them expressed his feelings about the situation." She felt something cold move through her chest. "Are you all right?" "Fine, some bruising, nothing broken." He stepped back. "Do you want to come in?" She came in. The room was small and clean and had a window overlooking the street. His saddle bags were on the chair. There was a tin cup on the table by the bed and a book open, face down, on the blanket. She looked at the book. It was a history of the Civil War, substantial and dense, the kind of thing a person read when they were trying to improve what had been interrupted. She looked at him. He was watching her look at the book with an expression she could not fully read. "Fessler has the deed," she said. "Judge Everett has an injunction. The state attorney is investigating. Prout is in trouble. I know. I've been making inquiries this morning." He paused. "You did that fast. You gave me what I needed to do it with." They stood in the small room looking at each other, and everything that had been accumulating for 3 years and before that was accumulating in the air between them with a density that was almost physical. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A proper one, not a note on a cot." "Yes," she agreed. "You do." The note was cowardly. "I was frightened, and I made a decision that I told myself was practical but was partly about fear. And I left you without adequate explanation, and I've thought about that regularly for 3 years." He held her gaze with the directness she had always found both challenging and enormously clarifying. "I am genuinely sorry for it, Mamie, for the fear it must have caused you and for the grief you faced alone afterward. Your father deserved better than that from me too." The words were so plainly and completely meant that she felt them settle in her chest in a way that was different from the anger she had been carrying. She took a breath. "My father thought well of you," she said. "I want you to know that. Even after you left, I could tell he did, in the way he talked about things." Edgar was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad of that." She sat down in the chair beside his saddle bags because her legs felt less reliable than she preferred them to. He sat on the edge of the bed, and they were facing each other in the afternoon light that came through the window, and it was remarkably similar to the evenings in her father's kitchen, which she suspected was not an accident on either of their parts. "Tell me where you've been," she said. "All of it. I want to know." He told her. It took almost 2 hours. He had gone first to Wichita, where he had connections from his previous life that were useful without being incriminating, and spent time learning what he could about Prute's operation. He had then spent a year moving between small towns in Kansas and the Northern Territory, doing work where he could find it, always with the Prute problem running beneath everything else. He had made 2 unsuccessful attempts to access Prute's records, the first of which had ended when he recognized Yarrow outside the building and had to abort, the second of which had ended when someone else entirely, a night watchman unconnected to Prute, had disrupted things. He had spent time in Abilene, working at a freight company, which was where he had located the saloon man who owed him the old favor, a man named Roby who had been with the Calhoun outfit briefly, and who now ran a legitimate business in Dodge City, and would very much prefer that nothing about his previous associations became public knowledge. Roby had provided Edgar with information about the layout of Prute's office building and the routines of the 2 men Prute kept there at night. He had gone in through a window, found the strongbox, opened it with a technique involving patience and a specific type of tension wrench that he described matter-of-factly, and that Mamie filed away as something she would think about later, and removed the 4 land deeds, replacing them with blank paper so the strongbox would feel full to the touch. He had been out of the building and riding within 12 minutes. He had gone to the county recorder's office first, delivered the 3 deeds and the letter of explanation, and then ridden for Hadley Ford. He had known Prute would have the strongbox opened and the loss discovered probably within 24 hours. He had estimated himself to have a lead of perhaps 18 to 24 hours, which had been accurate enough. Mamie listened to all of this and then sat with it for a moment. "You taught yourself to crack a safe," she said. "A lockbox, it's different, and I had some prior knowledge of the technique from." He stopped. "From before?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Edgar, your past is your past. I'm not going to pretend it isn't there or that it doesn't matter. But what I'm seeing is a man who made some choices in very difficult circumstances when he was young and who has been, consistently, trying to correct them. That matters to me. The trying matters." He looked at her with that expression she had seen in her yard at midnight, the one made of hope and the terror of hope. "I want to be straightforward with you about something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain speaking." She waited. "I'm not a man with much to offer. I have some skills, I have a work ethic, I have a great deal of care and respect for you that has not diminished over 3 years of absence, and I have no outstanding legal jeopardy that I'm aware of. What I don't have is money or property or any of the practical things that a woman ought to be able to expect from a man who—" He stopped again, and this time the control was slightly more effortful, "from a man who loves her." The word was in the room now, that specific word, and it had changed the room's atmosphere entirely. "I have heard plainer," Mamie said, "but I have not heard braver." He looked at her. "I am going to get my land back," she said. "That is going to happen. And when it does, I am going to need someone who is good at fencing and water management, and the kind of patient, methodical work that a cattle operation requires." She folded her hands in her lap. "I am also going to need someone who can read to me in the evenings or let me read to them, and who will tell me the truth about difficult things, and who will not leave a note on a cot and disappear for 3 years again under any circumstances." "No," he said, "not again." "Good." She stood up. "I am going back to my hotel room. You should sleep because you look like you have not done so properly in days. But Edgar," he stood, "come and find me at dinner tonight." "I will," he said. 7 o'clock, hotel dining room. "I'll be there." She went to the door and opened it and then turned back once, because this time she was going to look back, because looking back was not always the thing you should avoid. He was standing in the middle of the small room in the afternoon light, and his face had the look of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not been entirely certain he was going to arrive. She let herself smile at him, fully and without reservation. Then she went back to her room. The weeks that followed were some of the most consequential of Mamie Shepard's life, and they were also, underneath all the legal proceedings and the official testimony, and the careful, deliberate process of dismantling Harlan Prute's fraudulent land empire, some of the most unexpectedly joyful. She and Edgar had dinner that night, and every night for the rest of the time they were in Dodge City. They walked in the mornings before the legal proceedings began. They talked with the thoroughness of two people who had a great deal of missed time to account for, and who were both determined to account for it honestly. He told her about his childhood in Nebraska, which had been genuinely difficult in ways that made her angry on behalf of the 19-year-old boy he had been, and she told him about growing up on the ranch, which had been hard in different ways and good in others, and about her father in his better years, which she wanted Edgar to know about because she thought he would have appreciated Thomas Shepard more if he had known him earlier. She told Edgar about her mother, who had died when Mamie was 8, of a fever that swept through the county in the summer of 1867, the same summer her father had been driving fence posts into the ground and building the life the fever subsequently interrupted. Her father had raised her alone after that, with the help of neighboring women who understood what a man with a young daughter and a cattle operation needed, and Mamie had grown up in the specific way of frontier daughters, capable and independent, and somewhat more aware of the relationship between hard work and survival than most young women of her generation. Edgar listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he had always given her, and she understood, in a way she had not quite articulated before, that this was not a social skill or a performance. He was genuinely interested in her, in what she had experienced and what she thought about it and what it had made her. That was not common. She was aware that it was not common. Harlan Pruitt's empire collapsed faster than anyone except Judge Everett had predicted. The state attorney's investigators were efficient, and the evidence was thorough, which it had to be given that Edgar had delivered the actual original documents rather than copies or second-hand accounts. Pruitt's Wichita lawyer resigned from the case in the second week when it became clear that the evidence was going to require explanations that no lawyer could provide honestly. Cole Yarrow was located in Wichita, where he had been staying since the night he had caught up with Edgar south of the territory, and was arrested on charges relating to the theft of the county documents. He was persuaded, in the way that men in his position are sometimes persuaded, to provide testimony about Pruitt's operations in exchange for consideration on his own charges. Mamie provided her full testimony before the review board on the 9th day of the proceedings. She was precise, clear, and completely unintimidated by the process, which Fessler told her afterward was somewhat unusual for a first-time witness, and which she attributed privately to the fact that she had been preparing for this specific moment in one form or another for 3 years. The formal reversal of the Shepard property foreclosure was filed on the 14th day. The deed was hers. The land was hers. Thomas Shepard's 320 acres of Comanche County were returned to the estate of Thomas Shepard, to be administered by his sole surviving heir, Mamie Ann Shepard, in full and clear title, as of March 15, 1884. She was standing outside Fessler's office when he told her, and she had to stand very still for a moment and breathe carefully, because the feeling that went through her was larger than she had expected, and she needed a moment to contain it. Edgar was waiting on the street. She had asked him to wait outside because she had not been certain what the news would be and had wanted to receive it without an audience. But now, she walked to where he was standing against the porch railing and she told him, and he looked at her with an expression she was going to remember for the rest of her life, quiet and warm, and so entirely full of something he had been carrying for a long time that it made the afternoon feel different. "Your father would have been glad," he said. "He would have been glad," she agreed. "I am glad too." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so, and it was a completely simple gesture, fingers around hers, but in the context of everything that had happened and everything that had not happened and all the time between them, it was not simple at all. She turned her hand over and held his back. "Come home with me," she said, not the way she had said it at midnight on the porch, with the urgency of a dangerous situation. This was different. This was an invitation that had nothing to do with Prout or deeds or riding away. He knew the difference. She could see that he knew the difference. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. They returned to Hadley Ford in the company of Pete Donovan, and also, somewhat unexpectedly, Walter Crisp himself, who had ridden to Dodge City to be present for the legal resolution, because he felt he had been waiting for Prout to get what was coming to him long enough that he deserved to see it happen. Walter had also brought with him a quantity of practical Goodwill food, some tools, and the news that the neighboring families had been taking turns keeping an eye on the Shepard property, and that it was intact and standing and waiting. The ride home felt different from the ride to Dodge City, which had been cold and dark and full of urgency. This was a spring afternoon in Kansas, with the grass coming up green the way it did every year regardless of what human beings were doing to each other, and the sky was the wide specific blue of the plains, and Mamie Shepard was riding toward her land, her legitimate, legal, fully titled land, with Edgar Finley riding beside her. They talked as they rode, the easy talk of people who have run out of difficult things to say for the moment and are simply enjoying each other's company. And when the Shepard place came into view ahead of them, the white house and the barn and the fence lines and the well, Mamie felt something settle in her chest that she realized had been unsettled for 3 years and was only just finding its rest. She pulled her mare up at the gate and looked at it for a moment. Edgar stopped beside her. "It looks good," he said. "Walter's people kept it up. Still, it looks good." She opened the gate and they rode in. The following months were the kind of months that the Wild West, at its best and most ordinary, was actually made of, not the violent drama of legend, but the quiet, relentless work of building something. Mamie had the land back and the legal title clear, but the cattle operation was gone, the herd long dispersed, and the financial situation required starting from a smaller base than her father had built too. She had some savings. She had the land itself as collateral for a carefully structured bank loan that Andrew Fessler had helped her negotiate before she left Dodge City, and she had Edgar. Edgar had no significant money. He had what he had earned in 3 years of day labor and careful living, which amounted to enough to buy decent working stock and some seed, and the particular wrench set required for fence maintenance. He brought all of it and put it into the operation without any ceremony about it. What he also brought was the skills he had, which were genuine and extensive, and the kind of tireless practical intelligence that a recovery operation required. They worked side by side from early April through the summer, and by July they had 20 head of cattle, a repaired well pump, 2 new sections of fence, a properly functioning irrigation ditch off the creek, and a kitchen garden that was producing at a rate that satisfied even Mamie's exacting standards. They had also, by July, arrived at a different stage of the thing that had been growing between them, which required at some point an honest conversation about what exactly they were to each other and where they intended to be. Edgar had been staying in the hands' quarters, which were properly separate from the main house, and which provided the practical respectability that a young, unmarried woman needed in 1884 Kansas if she did not want to give the Hadley Ford gossip circuit more material than it already had. This arrangement was sensible and appropriate, and also, increasingly, somewhat beside the point given that they spent most of their waking hours together and talked through their evenings on the porch and were, in every meaningful sense, building a shared life. It was Mamie who said it first, which surprised neither of them. They were sitting on the porch on an August evening, the same porch where everything had changed at midnight in March, and the sun was going down in the way it did on the Kansas plains in summer, wide and slow and lavish with color, and she turned to him and said, "Edgar, I would like to marry you." He looked at her. "That's my proposal," she said. "You can make your own if you prefer, but I didn't want to wait around for you to get to it in your own time, because you have demonstrated that your own time is occasionally 3 years longer than necessary." He laughed a real laugh, full and warm, which she had not heard from him very often and which she found she wanted to hear considerably more. "You are not wrong about that," he said. "So, will you marry me?" He took her hand again, the way he had in Dodge City, and this time he held it for a long moment before he spoke. "Mamie Shepard," he said, "I have loved you since approximately November of 1880, and I would be honored to marry you." She leaned forward and kissed him then, in the warm evening light, the first time their lips had ever touched. And it was exactly what a first kiss should be in the middle of a life that had been building toward it, deliberate and warm and full of everything that had come before it. They were married in October of 1884 at the Hadley Ford Church by Reverend Calloway, who had known Thomas Shepard for 17 years and who was visibly moved by the occasion in a way he managed to keep out of his voice but not entirely out of his expression. Walter Crisp stood up for the groom, which Edgar had asked him to, with a quietness that had clearly affected the old rancher more than he was going to admit in public. Pete Donovan and his wife came, and Delia Marsh, who cried through the entire ceremony with the thoroughness of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the happiness she helped bring about by delivering important information in a breathless manner. The reception was at the Shepard place, which was now formally the Finley place as well, though Mamie kept her father's name on the deed alongside Edgar's, because she wanted Thomas Shepard's claim to the land to be part of its permanent record. The wedding was a good day. It was a simple day by the standards of some places, but the Plains make their own kind of abundance, and Hadley Ford, which had watched Mamie Shepard fight for 3 years to hold on to what was hers, turned out in force to celebrate with her, which said something about the kind of community it was at its best. Harlan Pruitt had been formally charged with land fraud in May and was awaiting trial in Wichita. His land acquisitions in Comanche County had been frozen pending the broader state investigation, and several of the families who had lost their properties to him were in various stages of recovering them through proceedings similar to Mamie's. The railroad land deal had collapsed when the title situation became public, which had cost Pruitt his financial backer and what remained of his local influence simultaneously. He was not coming back. Cole Yarrow had been convicted in September and sentenced to 18 months in the state penitentiary, which was not as long as might have been warranted but was, Mamie's lawyer had explained, the realistic outcome given that he had cooperated with the state's case. Edgar's old connection to the Calhoun outfit had come up once, during the investigation, when a state attorney's clerk had flagged his name against some old territory records. Judge Everett had handled it. He had reviewed the information, determined that Edgar had no paper against him, and had in fact functioned as a material witness in a significant fraud case, and had declined to pursue it further. The judge had said, when informally asked his view of the matter by Fessler, that a man who spent 3 years recovering stolen land deeds for the benefit of people he was not legally obligated to help had fairly well demonstrated his current moral character, whatever it had been in earlier years. Edgar had been told about this and had said little, but Mamie had seen what it meant to him, and she had thought again about what she had said in the hotel room in Dodge City, the trying matters, and she had felt it to be more true than ever. The first winter of their marriage was hard and good in equal measure. Kansas winters were not mild, and the ranch required the kind of attention that did not diminish with the cold, and they worked and managed and planned and stayed warm by the kitchen stove, and discovered everything about each other that daily proximity reveals, which is considerably more than the carefully curated sharing of a courtship. They argued twice, once about the water rights arrangement with a new neighbor to the south, and once about something more personal that Mamie would later describe only as a misunderstanding about what it means to carry a burden alone versus carrying it together, a distinction that Edgar was still working to fully internalize after a lifetime of solving his problems in isolation. Both arguments were resolved through the same mechanism, which was eventually saying the true thing that was underneath the surface argument, and finding that the true thing once said made the surface argument irrelevant. This was not a sophisticated discovery, but it was a real one, and they added it to the growing collection of things they knew about how to be married to each other. By the spring of 1885, Mamie was pregnant. She told Edgar on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, in the same direct way she said most things. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than what he was feeling. The pregnancy was healthy and uneventful in the way that pregnancies in 1884 Kansas could occasionally be, which meant it was difficult and exhausting, and required adjustments to the work of the ranch that they managed together with the practical creativity that had come to characterize how they handled most things. Walter Crisp's eldest daughter, who was also Pete Donovan's wife, came by regularly in the later months with food and company, and the particular kind of calm, experienced guidance that Mamie needed from someone who had been through it. In November of 1885, Mamie gave birth to a boy. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Finley came into the world on a cold November night, with a pair of lungs that left no ambiguity about his vigor, and a head of dark hair that he had clearly gotten from his father. Edgar sat with Mamie through most of the night and was present when the baby arrived, which was not the usual practice in Hadley Ford in 1885, but which Mamie had stated was non-negotiable, and which the midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Guthrie who had seen many things in her professional career, had accommodated with equanimity. Mamie held the baby and looked at Edgar and felt something she did not have an adequate word for, something that was made up of every difficult thing that had preceded this moment, and the specific extraordinary fact of the moment itself, and the man across from her, who was looking at his son with an expression that was completely defenseless in a way she had never seen him be before. "Hello, Thomas," she said to the baby. The baby regarded her with the philosophical calm of the very newly arrived. "He looks like your father," Edgar said. She looked at the baby again. "He does a little," she said, "around the forehead. Good, your father was a fine-looking man." She laughed quietly, careful not to disturb the baby's philosophical calm. Edgar moved closer and looked at his son, and then looked at her, and his face in the lamplight was open in a way that she thought he had probably been afraid to be open for most of his life and had been learning slowly and with effort to allow. "I love you, Mamie," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." Thomas slept, oblivious to the enormity of having caused this. The cattle operation grew steadily through 1885 and 1886, following the trajectory that careful management and good years together tend to produce. They added stock, repaired and extended the barn, hired a hand for the busiest seasons. A young man named Abe Clark, who had come through Hadley Ford looking for work, and who had a straightforward quality that reminded Mamie, in a small way, of Edgar at 25, and to whom Edgar was accordingly patient and fair in ways that Mamie found quietly beautiful. Hadley Ford itself was growing in the way that Kansas towns grew in those years, adding a hardware store and a second doctor, and a small school building that was actual and dedicated, and did not double as a church, which Walter Crisp had funded in part because he had strong feelings about the education of frontier children and was in a position to act on them. Mamie was on the school board, which she had been asked to join, and had accepted on the grounds that she had opinions about what children ought to learn and an inclination to make those opinions matter. Edgar served on the county water board, which was less prestigious than the school board but arguably more consequential given the climate of the southern plains, and he approached it with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything technical and practical. He had also, in the time since returning to Hadley Ford, developed a reputation for the kind of quiet reliability that made people bring him their difficult problems, fence line disputes, equipment failures, the occasional situation where someone needed a person who could think clearly and act without drama. He was not a prominent man in the way of politicians or merchants. He was a substantial man, which is different and in most contexts more valuable. He had continued to read. This was not a small thing for Mamie, who understood what it meant to him. He read slowly and deliberately, working through the dense Civil War history, and then through a natural history of the planes that Mamie had ordered from a catalog and presented to him on their first wedding anniversary, and then through an agricultural manual that turned out to be practically useful as well as educational. He read to Thomas in the evenings, when the boy was old enough to sit still for it, and Thomas did not know that his father was reading more carefully than other fathers did, and Edgar did not explain this, and Mamie thought it was one of the more elegant things she had seen a person do. In 1887, Mamie discovered she was pregnant again. This second pregnancy was somewhat harder than the first, the winter of 1887 being a genuinely brutal one across the plains that tested everyone's reserves of endurance and cheerfulness. Mamie managed it with the same unsentimental practicality she brought to everything, and Edgar managed it by expanding his domestic contributions to the household in ways he never mentioned or took credit for, which Mamie did not let pass unremarked because she had opinions about credit being given where it was due. In June of 1888, she gave birth to a girl. They named her Rose, which had been Mamie's mother's name, and she came into the world with the same dark hair as her brother and a specific expression of focused intensity that made Edgar say, when he saw it, that she already looked like she was thinking about something that no one else in the room had figured out yet. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had spent the preceding months in a state of uncertain awareness that something was changing, regarded his new sister with the cautious diplomatic interest of a small person who has been told this is a good development and is reserving final judgment. Mamie watched her husband hold their daughter for the first time and thought about a midnight in March 4 years ago, a man in her yard with his hands raised and a land deed on the porch railing, and all the versions of the future that that moment had not quite contained, and this one did. The Finley ranch went on. Seasons came and went with their particular demands. Thomas learned to walk, and then to run, and then to ride, the latter with a natural ease that made Edgar proud in the way of fathers who see themselves reflected in their children's aptitudes. Rose turned out to have an aptitude for everything she turned her attention to, which was expressed at age 3 in the form of a focused determination to understand the operation of every object in the household, and which Mamie recognized as something she would need to find constructive channels for, or it would find its own, less predictable ones. Walter Crisp died in 1889 of a heart attack quietly, in the way he had lived. He was 70 years old and had built his ranch from a dugout, and had seen Comanche County change from open range to settled farmland, and had been, in Mamie's estimation, one of the genuinely good people of the frontier, uncomplicated in his values and consistent in his actions, and decent in the way that requires effort and intention, rather than merely the absence of bad intentions. His funeral filled the new church, and then exceeded it, with the overflow standing outside in the October cold. Edgar was a pallbearer. He did it with the quiet dignity that he brought to the things that mattered, and afterward, when they were driving home in the wagon with the children asleep in the bed behind them, he said, "He was kind to me when I had no particular right to expect it." "He was like that," Mamie said. "I know, I'm just saying I knew it. He was quiet for a moment. I don't take it for granted, what people give you when they don't have to." She leaned against him on the wagon seat, which was not the most comfortable position given the road, but the road was not the point. He put his arm around her, and they drove home in the early dark with the stars coming out over the Kansas plains. Harlan Pruitt's trial had concluded in 1886 with a conviction on 6 counts of land fraud. He had received a sentence of 5 years in the state penitentiary, which his lawyers had reduced to 3 through appeals. He had served the 3 years and been released in 1889, at which point he had apparently left Kansas entirely. There were reports of him in Colorado, then in California, none of them confirmed, and all of them equally uninteresting to Mamie, who had moved well beyond the point of finding Harlan Pruitt's whereabouts relevant to her life. Cole Yarrow had served his 18 months and not been heard from since, which was the ideal outcome. The state investigation had returned property to 11 families in Comanche and neighboring counties. This was good and right and also inadequate, since some families had already left during the years of fraudulent dispossession and could not easily return, and some had lost things that property recovery could not restore. Mamie thought about this sometimes, the incompleteness of justice, the way that it could be done and still not fully undo the harm. She thought about what her father had not lived to see, and she held both the grief and the gratitude at once, because they were both true and she had learned not to require them to cancel each other out. Thomas started school in 1891, the year he turned 6, in the dedicated school building that Walter Crisp had helped fund. He was a quiet, attentive student who asked careful questions and had already demonstrated that he had inherited his mother's capacity for thorough reading and his father's capacity for patient practical analysis, which was, Mamie reflected, an excellent combination if properly directed. Rose, at 3, was waiting her turn with an impatience that she expressed primarily by sitting in on Thomas's evening reading sessions and occasionally correcting his pronunciation, which Thomas accepted with the philosophical tolerance of an older brother who has learned that there are faster ways to get through the evening if you don't argue about things that don't matter. In the spring of 1892, Mamie discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, and she told Edgar at the kitchen table over coffee the same way she had told him the first 2 times. He looked at her with the same open, defenseless expression, though this time he also said, "We are going to need to add on to the house." "I've been thinking about that," she said. "The north side, another room and expand the kitchen. I was thinking south side, but we can discuss it." They discussed it for approximately 3 weeks in the patient, thorough way they discussed most large decisions, and arrived at a plan that incorporated elements of both positions, as was generally the case. In November of 1892, the same month that Thomas Finley had been born 7 years earlier, Mamie gave birth to her 2nd son. They named him Walter, for the man who had stood by them when standing by them had required real conviction. Walter Finley came into the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, evident from approximately the first 3 minutes of his existence, and the household adjusted around this new fact of itself, with the particular combination of chaos and warmth that 3 young children in a farmhouse produce. The house addition was built in the spring of 1893, with help from Pete Donovan and 2 other neighboring men who showed up over a 3-day period with tools and opinions and a genuine willingness to work. And it was one of those projects that becomes, in a community, a kind of statement. This family is here. This land is theirs. This house is going to be bigger because their life in it is going to continue. Edgar stood back and looked at the finished structure on the evening of the 3rd day, when the other men had gone home, and the children were inside, and the sun was going down in its usual extravagant prairie fashion, and Mamie stood beside him. "Your father built good," he said, meaning the original structure. "He did." She looked at the whole of it, the old and the new together, the lines where they joined. "You build good too." He looked at her sideways. "I mean it," she said, "not just the house." She turned to face him. "This, all of this. You built this with me." He took her hand in the way he had first taken it in Dodge City in front of Fessler's office and held it the same way, completely and carefully. "I nearly didn't get here," he said. "I know. I nearly left the deed on the porch and rode away. I know that too. You said come inside. I did. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the house and the barn and the fences running out into the evening, the cattle moving at the far end of the pasture, the smoke from the chimney of the house where their 3 children were currently doing whatever 3 children do in a house at supper time, which sounded from outside like a significant amount of productive activity. "Best thing you ever did," he said. "I have done a good many sensible things," she said. "That was one of them." He laughed and pulled her close, and she leaned against him in the evening air that smelled of grass and cattle, and the particular sweetness of a Kansas spring turning toward summer. Behind them the house was lit against the coming dark, and the sounds coming from it were the sounds of a family in the middle of itself, ordinary and irreplaceable. Mamie Shepard, who was Mamie Finley now, had her father's land and her mother's name on her daughter and her husband beside her and 3 children in the house that her father had built, and that she had fought for, and that she intended to hand on to the people who came after her with all the history it contained, the hard years and the fraudulent dispossession, and the midnight return of a folded deed, by a man who had made a very long journey to bring it back. All of it was the land's history now. All of it was hers. Edgar Finley, who had come to Hadley Ford in 1880 on a gray horse with a worn saddle, had built something he had not been certain he was going to be allowed to have a life of genuine substance in a place that knew his name and needed his work, and where the woman he loved had said, at midnight with a rifle in her hands, "Come inside before you ride away." He thought about that sometimes, about the fraction of a moment it had been, about how easy it would have been to say he couldn't, to tip his hat and ride south into the dark and call it done. He thought about what he would have missed. He thought about it the way you think about near misses when you are standing safely on the other side of them, with a gratitude that requires the imagination of loss to fully feel. He never rode away again. The Kansas plains went on being what they were, wide and demanding, and occasionally brutal, and lit in certain seasons with a beauty that made every difficult thing worth it. The Finley Ranch went on being what it was. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, capable young man who had his father's patience and his mother's determination, and a genuine gift for the agricultural management that the land required. Rose grew into something that confounded all expectations and fulfilled all of her mother's hopes, a sharp-minded, clear-eyed young woman who read everything and argued everything, and had opinions about water rights and railroad policy, and the rights of the farming families that were displacing the same indigenous peoples whose land this had been before it was anyone else's, which was a topic she and her father discussed with a seriousness that Mamie found hopeful in the specific way of parents who see their children thinking harder than they did. Walter grew into himself at a pace that was entirely his own, which was in fact the fastest pace of the 3, and became at age 7 the kind of child who appears to have been 40 for most of his life, full of a practical gravity that coexisted with a joyfulness that emerged specifically in the presence of animals and machinery, and the particular pleasure of fixing things that were broken. In the fall of 1894, Mamie and Edgar celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, which was marked by a dinner at the Hadley Ford Hotel, just the 2 of them, for the first time since Dodge City. They dressed up and went out and sat across a table from each other in the same restaurant where they had eaten a decade before, and they talked for 3 hours, ranging across everything from the ranch's prospects for the next season to the question of whether Walter should be allowed to disassemble the well pump, which he had requested permission to do purely on the grounds of curiosity about its mechanism. "He put the gate latch back together correctly," Edgar said. "The gate latch is not a well pump. He explained to me how the pump works before he asked to take it apart. He was correct in every particular. He's 9 years old. He was also 9 when he explained it." Edgar paused. "I'll supervise." "Of course you will supervise." She looked at him across the table. "What was I thinking that you would hand him tools and walk away?" "I never walk away," he said. The statement was simple and exact and had the weight of everything they both knew about what it meant. "No," she agreed. You don't. Outside the hotel windows, Hadley Ford went about its evening business, horses and wagons on the main street, lamplight in the windows of the general store, the sound of the piano from one of the 3 saloons that still stood, somewhat reduced in their collective enthusiasm, on the east end of town. It was 1894, and the frontier was becoming something else slowly, with the weight of all the people coming west and all the land being claimed and fenced and contested and built upon, and the wildness of it was being replaced, year by year, with the particular civilization that human beings construct wherever they stop long enough. It was becoming ordinary, which is what places become when the dangerous part of their history passes. Ordinary was good. Ordinary meant the violence and the fraud and the dispossession, and the long insecurity of building a life in an unsettled place, were moving into memory rather than pressing immediately against the present. Mamie Shepard Finley sat in the hotel dining room in her good dress, across from the man she loved, and thought about midnight on a March porch with a rifle in her hands, and the land deed on the railing, and the question she had asked that had changed everything. She thought about her father driving fence posts into the ground in 1867. She thought about Thomas Finley growing up learning to read by lamplight. She thought about Rose having opinions about water rights. She thought about the gate latch, fixed quietly and without mention, one morning before any of the rest of it had happened. "Edgar," she said. He looked at her across the table. "I'm glad you came inside." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, exactly as he had on the porch in 1880 when none of this yet existed, exactly as he had in Dodge City when the land was coming back and the life ahead of them was taking shape, exactly as he always did, carefully and completely. "So am I," he said. The lamp on the table between them burned steadily. Outside, the Kansas night did what it always did, spread itself wide and dark and full of stars across the sky above the plains, above the ranch and the fences and the well and the house with the addition on the north side and the 3 children in it, above the ground that Thomas Shepard had worked and that Mamie Finley had recovered, and that the family building itself on it intended to keep. It was theirs, all of it. It was going to stay that way.